Hello, welcome to WorkRise Shorts. I'm Bill Congdon, a research advisor at WorkRise, which is a research to action network focused on jobs, workers, and mobility, hosted by the Urban Institute. We have a great conversation lined up today with Ellora Derenoncourt, who is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University. We'll be diving into their recent research report on how unemployment insurance can repair racially exclusionary labor market policies. Ellora, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right in. What exact problem were you hoping your research would address, solve, or advance? What's the change that you want to see that your research informs?
So, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the country and firms shut down due to the crisis, employment relationships in the US were severed. Okay, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed to around 15%. And extremely significant policy during this period was federal pandemic unemployment compensation. So, first, one of the things that this did was extend coverage to groups that are typically not covered by UI, including new entrants into the labor market, gig workers, et cetera. And second, it was a federal top up that helped address inequality in generosity in benefits across states. And that actually led to UI benefits in some areas to exceed private sector wages. So we're interested in the impact of these kinds of bold policies on inequality in social insurance across different groups of workers, including by race and ethnicity and gender. And inequalities in eligibility and UI receipt by race really do continue to plague the system. And recent research has shown that much of this gap can be attributed to differences in state policies and differences in where, for example, Black and white workers live. And what we're doing in this study is to look at this question historically and follow the development of the unemployment insurance system since the late 1930s. And we're interested in changes in both federal and state policy that have shifted eligibility for different groups. And we're examining the effect of these policy changes on coverage and eventually on economic outcomes that will hopefully inform us about the effects of expanding coverage even today.
It is certainly a timely and important set of policy and research questions. What are some of the key research findings from the project so far?
So our project has consisted of a large-scale digitization effort. We built a new database of harmonized state unemployment insurance rules that again date back to the inception of this joint federal state UI system. The database covers all 50 states plus DC, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And importantly, we record over 60 original and derived characteristics of state rules. These include, for example, monetary and non-monetary eligibility qualifications for individuals, as well as firm coverage rules. And then we also document the generosity of benefits, including weekly benefit formulas, benefit minima and maxima, benefit duration minima and maxima, so on and so forth. And the database also covers funding information from the beginning, again, of the UI system, including how states collect funds and whether they use employer experience rating. So that was, the first, part of the project. It was a monumental effort that has taken years. And with these data, we have documented so far 2 key facts. The first is the rise in complexity of UI rules across states and over time. And the second is vast differences in unemployment insurance coverage by race and gender that have been present since the beginning of the system. These have closed significantly over time, but significant gaps remain. And so on the first set of results, what we do is document the presence of multiple rules for eligibility or multiple conditions by which individuals can qualify. And this gives us a sense of the complexity of the policy. So an example of a one rule policy at a given state would be a rule that stipulates that individuals earn a minimum amount over, say, a base year in order to be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits. A multiple rule policy would be one where earnings not only must be over that minimum amount, but they also must be distributed in some fashion across sub periods within that base year, typically quarters. Now, at the start of our period, 40 out of 50 states were one rule states. There was just one rule that explained how you qualify for unemployment insurance. And today, virtually all states are multi-rule states. And some of these rules can really get quite complex. And that raises this issue of workers potentially not knowing or it being very difficult to find out if they're even eligible. The other finding is that the vast majority of Black women were ineligible for UI at the start of the system and women overall. And the majority were ineligible really until the 1980s. We also find that Black men's eligibility has been lower than that of all other groups of men for essentially the entire history of unemployment insurance. And these gaps appear to be widening now. So let me just dive into how we're measuring eligibility here. We construct what we call measures of upper bound eligibility by a process of flattening these rather complex state UI rules that I just mentioned. So instead of focusing on whether an individual satisfies all parts of the rule, we focus on a minimum eligibility component. So, for example, in a multi-rule state where individuals have to earn a minimum amount in the base year, and those earnings have to be distributed across quarters in a certain amount, we define what we call the upper bound eligible population as those who at least meet the minimum earnings amount. The reason for kind of flattening these rules and abstracting from some of the complexity is because we need to map this set of rules onto data where we're constrained in what we observe. So we're going to calculate upper bound eligibility for workers from different groups using historical census data. And there we pretty much only know, if you go far back enough, annual earnings. So using this definition of upper bound eligibility, we're going to find that fewer than 15% of Black women were eligible at the start of the UI system and fewer than 25% of all other groups of women. And much of the exclusion, when it comes to women, comes from both labor market attachment. So this is a period over the last 60, 70, 80 years of rising labor force participation among women. And attachment is one of those factors that matters for eligibility. But a very important component of these gaps in coverage is the exclusion of certain sectors. And for Black workers and Black women in particular, the exclusion of agriculture and domestic service from UI coverage was highly consequential. Now, on the flip side, expansion of UI coverage to these sectors at a federal level, which occurred in the 1970s, engendered probably the biggest reductions in gaps in eligibility across racial groups.
An important set of findings in a lot of ways. I wondered if you could tell me who are the primary communities that you feel be most impacted by the issue you're studying, and how are those voices included in the research process?
So racial minorities, women, workers who are in sectors that aren't currently covered by unemployment insurance, those who are more marginally attached to the labor force, all of those workers are impacted by the policy that we're studying. And, we're studying this primarily in historical populations, so we can't really consult,
Right.
these individuals, and there are very limited firsthand accounts. But to the extent that we can access these stories, we see that the devastation that is created by joblessness combined with a lack of a social safety net is highly severe. And so the safety net is important for mitigating and helping workers weather shocks in their careers, but also for mitigating inequalities across groups of workers.
Um, for today, which actors do you think are best positioned to advance your research? Policymakers, certain employers, advocates, certain sectors, workers themselves? And what do you hope they will do or change based on what you found?
So, policymakers, worker advocates, labor organizations such as unions, workers themselves. I guess you could say all of those actors are,
Right.
um, critical in this topic, and their actions, decisions, and choices allow us to then evaluate impacts of these policies. Policymakers, specifically through implementing policies that reduce gaps in coverage. So when those kinds of policies occur, that provides this natural experiment, this moment to study the impact of reducing coverage gaps on a host of other economic well-being measures, conditional on having the data to observe that. And then advocates and unions, workers themselves are critical in ensuring take up. So, with some of these really complex rules, unions play a super important role in digesting those rules and facilitating take up of UI for eligible workers. And so, I think those are the kinds of labor market institutions where we can see their presence actually mattering for take up and therefore for the realized inequality in benefit receipt.
Ellora, thank you again so much for joining us and for sharing your work with us. We're really excited to see more work on this topic from you in the future. To learn more about this research, please visit the research and data page on WorkRise's website, which you can find at www.workrisenetwork.org.